Hey everyone, in the first section of this class, we're going to focus on the book Calling Bullshit, and more generally, we're going to focus on evidence and the role it plays in public policy. I'm going to start out with this video, just focusing on the question of what is bullshit and why do we care about it, why does it matter for policy. So this one is from the book, and it argues strongly that nothing you're going to learn in the course of your studies will be of the slightest possible use to you, save only this: that if you work hard and intelligently, you should be able to detect when a man is talking rot. And that, in my view, is the main, if not the sole, purpose of education. So some of you are going to go out and do public policy analysis, but almost all of you are going to consume it in some form. And that means it's really important to be a good bullshit detector, to know when someone is trying to pull one over on you, or when the evidence just isn't there for a case someone's making. So there's a book called On Bullshit by Harry Frankfurt, and one of the things he argues is that bullshit is essentially distinguished by the factor of being not about true and false, right? So like there's this intentional lying, and we'll talk about that some too, because that happens as well. But there's also this sort of fact-free zone where people are just saying things for the sake of saying things. And that's sort of what bullshit is, as defined, by Frankfurt and others. And a very salient feature of bullshit that shapes a lot of the dynamics here is that it takes more effort to refute bullshit. See, the advantage that you have if you're just making stuff up is you just make stuff up and then that's done. I mean, it requires some creativity, probably some skill at public speaking, and certainly some shamelessness. Being willing to claim things with no evidence does require some amount of, immunity to shame or just not feeling it. But in order to refute bullshit, you actually have to have evidence and engage with it factually, and, this is a bit of a mismatch. So evidence, misinformation, and so forth can spread much faster than any sort of refutation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about social media, because that's one of the topics in Chapter 2. To be clear, this is not a new problem to social media, but it does interact with social media in interesting ways. So they talk about misinformation spreading easily through social media, in part because it's easy to produce, easy to engage with, tells people what they want to hear. Note there might be some perverse incentives where, like, at least short-term engagement is possibly increased by bullshit, and long-term engagement may not be. But I want to point out that even when individual social media companies want to stop misinfo and are actively working on it, it's a really hard problem. Apologies for the sports analogy in advance. Ignore it if it's not helpful. But I was watching some football yesterday, and it occurred to me that, the idea of catching a football. You're catching a ball. Like, this seems very straightforward, right? And yet there are a ton of rules where it's actually a very complicated problem. And I can't remember the last weekend I watched a football game and there wasn't a pause or a replay to be like, did they actually catch the football? Did they have 1 foot in bounds, 2 feet in bounds? These rules differ, different places, college versus pro, etc. But my point is, you have something very straightforward conceptually, catching something. But then when you go to do the actual work of applying it, it turns out to be very complicated. And I think you have some of the same thing going on with misinformation. Like, we might think we know it when we see it, but how do you identify it at scale? How do you actually define it? And then how do you avoid taking down things that are not misinformation? Note that at the scale of social media, if you do it right 99 times out of 100, you are still doing it wrong thousands or tens of thousands of times a day, just with that 1% of time that you're doing it wrong, right? And that also has its cost. So you might have to balance that against, how aggressively you can go after misinfo versus how much you risk taking down things that are not misinfo, right? My point is just, even approached in good faith, this is a very difficult problem. Generative AI theoretically might make this problem worse. I think there have been a lot of predictions that it would already be a lot worse based on generative AI having been around for a while at this point. The cost of bullshit does go down. The cost of refuting it is actually rising. I think my biggest worry here is that we've actually become just less likely to trust everything. So one thing I'm going to say several times in this class is, while it is good to be skeptical of information, do not let that skepticism turn into cynicism to the point where you just believe nothing, because that is also a huge problem. So, we need these sorts of ways to process information, in part because it's unrealistic to think every person is going to investigate everything they hear. They don't have the time or capacity, or, frankly, don't want to. They have better things to do. So we need some sort of information filters that people can trust. And these have largely been breaking down over the past couple of years as trust in institutions has declined. Okay, I'm going to go into one of these, I think, next week, but there's also a lot of black box algorithms that are highlighted in this book, and also some of these are coming from elsewhere. Allegheny County put out an algorithm to detect child abuse and neglect, but it's actually trained on whether or not additional calls are made to youth services, which is a different thing than whether or not there's child abuse or neglect. Recidivism and parole, there's an algorithm called Compass that's used. It's racially biased. You can see the link in there for more. There was a AI that was supposed to detect criminality, but actually it detected basically mugshots and was based on smiling or not. And then I've already talked about how this was already an existing problem, and so generative AI may make it worse. Okay, I'm going to pause the video here, and I'm going to make a second one for the week on understanding causation.